I'm Nora Bennett, 33 years old, and the night it all shifted began with Crystal singing against Crystal in my parents' kitchen, the sound sharp as ice in my veins. My father lifted his flute like a man satisfied with a deal, my mother's smile tight and practiced under the recessed lights. Down the hall, balloons bobbed on satin ribbons, and somewhere a child laughed, but the house felt colder than winter stone. I thought about my daughter upstairs, 6 years old, in unicorn pajamas, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Then my father said, "Finally she'll match her worth," and my mother laughed in a way that never meant joy. I didn't wait for permission, and I didn't wait for sense. I ran the staircase, heaving up to meet me, the world narrowing to a single door at the end of the hall. By the time my hand hit the knob, I knew something about my life was breaking for good. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand your ground for someone you love, tap like and subscribe so more folks can hear stories like this. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than air, where good posture and quiet voices were praised, while questions were treated like stains. You scrub and scrub, but never mention. The Parkers knew the right clubs, the right charities, the right way to set a table for 12, and my mother could correct a napkin fold without looking down. I learned kindness from the librarians who remembered my name, from the neighbor who left warm bread on our porch after church, from the school custodian who taught me how to tighten a loose screw instead of waiting for someone else to notice. When I chose to become a children's librarian, it wasn't rebellion, it was relief. Books made sense, children made sense, and there was no pretense in a room where a dragon could be a friend and a cardboard crown made you royalty for the hour. My parents' world ran on a different currency estate, lawns clipped to the inch, a foyer that smelled like lemon wax and money holiday cards with embossed names, and a photographer's lighting kit. The night we drove up the long gravel curve to their home in Connecticut, Grace pressed her nose to the window and whispered, "It's so big, Mommy." I told her it was just a house, even if it didn't feel like one to me. Inside, everything gleamed: white pillars, glass vases taller than a second grader, a cake table being fussed over by my brother Andrew and his wife Brooke. Harper, 7, and Starbright in a pink dress skipped over to say hello, her voice bouncing off the chandelier, and Grace hid half behind my leg, shy but smiling. My mother's heels clicked toward us, pearls steady at her throat, eyes gliding over my dress, then pausing on Grace's yellow ribbon with a flicker I'd learned to recognize since childhood. I've known for years that in this family, love had conditions that changed like the weather, and some of us were always standing in the wind. My parents never liked Ethan. He was a mechanic with grease under his nails and an easy laugh, and that made him invisible to them. After the divorce, they decided it proved everything they'd always said, and they folded that story into their favorite routine. My choices as proof of my shortcomings, my daughter as a reminder of the path they would have picked for me if I'd only listened. I tried not to bring Grace into that room where approval felt like a switch you couldn't reach, but she had never been to one of Harper's birthday parties, and she asked so sweetly that I packed her favorite pajamas and told myself I could handle an afternoon for her sake. It was supposed to be balloons and pictures and cousins crowding a table, plastic forks bending under frosting. In the first hour, I did the small dances I've done my whole life, answering questions about my job with a steady smile, pretending not to notice the way my father's mouth folded when I mentioned story time at the library or the new grant we'd won for Saturday programs. Andrew was kinder than most, but kindness bends in our family when our parents are watching, and he bent without seeming to know he'd moved. When Grace rubbed her eyes, I led her to the guest room I used to share with my old diary and a window that caught morning sun, and she curled into the quilt like she'd always belonged there. I kissed her hair and told her the party would start soon and to rest for a bit, and she nodded, already slipping toward sleep. In the hallway, I could hear Brooke asking for another cake knife, my mother giving instructions in a voice as smooth as the marble under our feet. Back in the kitchen, the champagne flutes were already lined like soldiers, and my father's hand hovered in the air. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and maybe that was the point. My mother's laugh followed, practiced and bright, and in that sound was the old rule books of my childhood. Some people are real, and some people are reminders. The words slid through the room and caught in me, and a shape I know too well pressed itself against my ribs. Beware, Beware, beware. I thought of Grace's soft breath against the pillow, the little line where she bites her lip when she's thinking the ribbon I tied crooked because she wouldn't hold still. The house was suddenly too quiet for a party. Even the balloons seemed to be listening. I didn't argue. I didn't finish my sentence. I just moved the click of my shoes, swallowed by carpet, as the kitchen, the cake table, and the chandeliers blurred into a single straight line, all of it pointing to the room at the end of the hall. The banister was cool under my palm, and every step felt like the kind you don't get to take back. Before the door I paused long enough to hear something I couldn't name, a hush too deep for a child's nap. The sort of silence that turns the air heavy. My fingers found the knob, and the metal bit cold into my skin. That was the moment I understood the toast wasn't just cruel, it was a warning. I turned the handle and pushed, bracing for whatever was waiting on the other side. The doorknob turned slower than I meant for it to. The faint click was swallowed by the heavy quiet on the other side, a silence so complete it didn't sound like sleep. I stepped in and froze. Sunlight from the half-drawn curtains fell across the bed, the stuffed bunny tucked beneath Grace's arm, and the pillow where a small smear of red caught the light. At first, my mind refused to name what it saw. Then the shape of it rushed in, the swelling, the bruises, her lips split open. I said her name soft at first, then louder, until the sound scraped my throat, raw. She didn't move. My knees hit the floor before I realized I'd fallen. The world closed in around her tiny body, every breath I took tasting of iron and fear. My fingers trembled as I checked her pulse, faint, but there. I snatched my phone and dialed 911. The numbers blurred through tears as I tried to keep my voice steady. "My daughter. She's hurt. She's bleeding. Please send someone." The dispatcher's voice was calm, asking if she was breathing. Barely, I said, "Please hurry." I wrapped Grace in a blanket and lifted her, feeling her blood soak through my blouse. Her head rested against my shoulder, too still, too light. I stumbled down the stairs, calling for help. My father appeared first, his face composed in that practiced way of his, though I caught the flicker of something, fear or guilt, before it vanished. My mother stepped out from the hallway, her champagne glass still in hand. "What happened?" my brother shouted from the living room, his wife Brooke clutching Harper's hand behind him. "They did this." I cried, my voice breaking as I turned toward my parents. "They hurt her while she was asleep." My father blinked as if I'd spoken in a language he didn't recognize. "That's absurd," he said quickly. "She must have fallen. You probably left the window open." "Fallen," I shouted. "Look at her face." Brooke's hand flew to her mouth as she grabbed her phone, whispering into it as she redialed 911. Andrew's eyes darted between us, disbelief and confusion colliding across his face. My mother finally set down her glass, the crystal chiming against the counter. "You always make such a scene, Nora," she said, her voice like ice. "She's 6 years old," I said, shaking. "You could have told me if you didn't want her here." Evelyn's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What fun would that be? I wanted everyone to see that only my real grandchild matters." Her hand gestured lazily toward Harper. "That little girl you had with that mechanic is a mistake." The room tilted. I lunged before I could stop myself, fury hotter than pain, but Andrew caught me, pulling me back as sirens echoed outside. Blue and red lights flashed through the window, painting the marble floor like broken glass. That was the last moment I would ever stand in that house as a daughter. Paramedics poured through the doorway, voices calm but quick, guiding me onto the porch as they lifted Grace from my arms. One of them, a woman with short, dark hair, pressed a hand to my shoulder. "We've got her," she said. The doors of the ambulance closed, and the world narrowed to the sound of the engine and the steady rhythm of machines inside. I climbed in beside her. They worked fast oxygen mask V, murmured instructions I didn't understand. I sat there gripping her tiny hand, whispering that she wasn't alone, that I was right there. At the hospital, fluorescent lights washed everything in sterile brightness. A nurse guided me toward the waiting area, while others rushed Grace through double doors. "Please," I begged, "I'm her mother. Let me stay." "We'll bring you as soon as we can," she said, gentle but firm. The doors swung shut, and I was left in the hum of machines and footsteps. My hands empty. A calm voice spoke beside me. "Ms. Bennett." I turned and saw a woman in uniform, Officer Dana Ruiz. Her tone was steady, her eyes kind. "I need to ask you what happened tonight." I told her everything. The champagne toast, my father's words, my mother's laughter, the silence that followed. I told her what I saw when I opened that door. My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. She wrote quickly, her brow tightening as I spoke. "You're saying your parents assaulted your child?" "Yes," I said. "They didn't say it directly, but they didn't have to. My father said she'd match her worth. My mother said only her real grandchild mattered." "Did anyone else hear that? My brother and his wife?" Ruiz nodded. "We'll get their statements." Through the glass wall I could see flashes of movement. Doctors and nurses working around Grace's small body, a monitor beeping in uneven rhythm. Every time someone said, "Clear," my heart stopped. Andrew arrived minutes later, pale and shaking. "How is she?" he asked. "I don't know," I whispered. "They're still working. The police are talking to Mom and Dad," he said, voice tight. "They're acting like nothing happened, like you imagined it." A laugh slipped out of me, sharp, bitter. "Of course they are." The doctor came through the doors, removing his gloves, his face grave. "She's alive," he said softly, "but she's in critical condition. We're moving her into surgery. Can I see her?" He hesitated, then nodded, for a moment. They let me into the hall just long enough to touch her hand and press a kiss to her forehead. "Fight, baby," I whispered. "Please fight." They wheeled her away, and I stood there watching until the last glimpse of her disappeared behind the swinging doors. The rest of the night blurred into the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the sound of my own breathing trying to stay steady. 2 hours later, Ethan burst through the waiting room doors, his hair damp with rain, his face pale. "I came as soon as I got your call," he said, gripping the back of the chair beside me. "Are they? Did your parents?" I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "They laughed, Ethan. They actually laughed." He sat beside me, taking my hand. "Then they'll pay," he said quietly. "I swear it." We sat like that until the nurse returned, her shoes squeaking softly on the tile. "The surgery's underway," she said. "Dr. Kim is doing everything possible." The clock above the desk ticked past 3, then 4, then 5. Every sound from the hallway made my heart stop. When Dr. Kim finally came out, she looked exhausted, her blue scrubs spattered with crimson. "She's alive," she said gently. We relieved the pressure on her brain, but she's still in critical condition. The next 24 hours are crucial. I nodded, unable to speak. Ethan wrapped his arm around my shoulders, and we sat in silence until morning light slipped through the windows. The following afternoon, Officer Ruiz returned. "Your parents are in custody," she said. "They're being charged with aggravated assault and child abuse. Depending on Grace's recovery, that could become attempted murder." The words echoed through me, hollow and heavy. Attempted murder. My parents. The same people who corrected my grammar at the dinner table, who made me curtsy for photographs, who told me to smile wider for guests. I thought of my mother's face when I accused her, the calm satisfaction, as if she'd proven something. I thought of my father's steady tone, the one that had always made me shrink. All those years I told myself their strictness was love, that the rules and comparisons were just their way of caring. But sitting there in that white room, listening to machines breathe for my child, I saw it for what it was, control disguised as affection. That night, the hall outside the ICU was dim except for the glow of the monitors. I sat by Grace's bed, holding her hand, tracing the small pulse beneath her wrist. Somewhere between the quiet hum and the nurse's soft footsteps, her fingers moved. I leaned closer, hardly breathing. "Grace," I whispered. Her fingers tightened weakly around mine. Her eyelids fluttered open, swollen but alive. "Mommy," she croaked, the sound barely there. I pressed my forehead to hers. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe." Her lips trembled. "It hurts." "I know, baby." "You're so brave." When Dr. Kim came in and saw her eyes open, she smiled relief, softening her face. "She's a fighter," she said. I stayed there long after everyone else left, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing. The night outside was still, the air heavy with rain. Grace stirred again and whispered, "Where's Grandma and Grandpa?" My throat closed. "They're not coming, honey," I said quietly. "They did something very bad." Her brow furrowed, confusion flickering through the bruises. "Did they hit me?" I nodded, the word catching in my throat. "Why?" "Because they're broken inside," I said softly. "But you're not. You're perfect." Her eyes drifted shut, and I sat there listening to the steady hum of the monitors, my hand wrapped around hers. Outside the window, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Somewhere in that pale glow, I made a promise I would not break. Whatever it took, I would make sure they never touched her again. And in the quiet that followed, I knew the fight for justice had only just begun. The first night home after Grace woke up felt like a fragile kind of quiet. Machines still hummed beside her bed, and the dim light from the monitors painted soft shadows on her bandaged face. Every beep reminded me that she was still here, still fighting. I hadn't slept in days, afraid that if I blinked too long, she'd slip away again. Ethan stayed in the chair by the window, his jacket draped across the armrest, staring at the floor, as if the right words might appear there. When the nurse came in to check the readings, she gave me a kind smile and said, "She's stable tonight. Try to rest, Mom." I nodded, though I knew I wouldn't. By morning, the air in the ICU had changed. Grace's breathing steadied her heartbeat strong enough that the nurses started talking about moving her to a recovery room. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched rain streak down the panes. The world outside was still moving, cars, people, lives, continuing like none of this had happened. Inside, time hung suspended between hope and fear. Later that day, Officer Ruiz came back with a folder tucked under her arm. She spoke quietly near the doorway so Grace wouldn't hear. "Your parents are being held without bail," she said. "They've been formally charged with aggravated assault and child abuse. We're waiting on the DA to confirm if attempted murder will be added." Her words landed like a dull weight. I didn't know what to say, only that hearing their names attached to those charges felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. When Ruiz left, Dr. Kim stepped in, her voice calm as always. "Grace's injuries are severe," she explained gently, "but she's responding better than expected. There's swelling to her left optic nerve. We'll monitor for lasting damage." I nodded, gripping the bed rail until my knuckles turned white. Grace stirred at the sound of her name, her lips barely moving. "Mommy," she whispered. I leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe." Her small hand found mine, and for the first time since that night, I believed it. The next few days blurred into a rhythm of hospital routines, nurses changing bandages, doctors checking charts, Ethan bringing coffee. I barely drank. Reporters began calling the hospital, and we were moved to a private wing for privacy. Andrew visited once, standing awkwardly at the doorway, guilt carved into every line of his face. "I gave my statement," he said quietly. "They know what Mom said. They know you didn't imagine it." His voice cracked, and for a moment he looked more like the boy who used to sneak me cookies after dinner than the man caught between his sister and the parents who raised us. "I'm sorry," he whispered before leaving. Grace's recovery was slow but steady. When the swelling around her eyes lessened, she asked for her stuffed bunny, and I knew she was finding her way back, piece by piece. At night, when the hallways went quiet, I could still hear the echo of my father's toast, the clinking glasses, the smug certainty in his voice. It played over and over until it became a kind of background noise to my thoughts. I had spent years explaining away their cruelty, telling myself they were strict, that their expectations came from love. Now the mask had fallen, and what stood behind it was something colder than I'd ever allowed myself to name. 2 weeks after the attack, Grace was cleared to go home under supervision. Dr. Kim gave me a folder full of instructions, medications, therapy appointments, follow-up scans. She touched my arm before leaving and said, "She's alive because you didn't freeze Ms. Bennett. Don't forget that." I wanted to thank her, but the words caught somewhere behind the ache in my throat. Home was different now. The apartment smelled faintly of antiseptic from the medical supplies lined along the counter. Grace's drawing still hung on the refrigerator, all sunshine and rainbows now faded under the fluorescent kitchen light. Ethan set up a small bed for her in the living room so she wouldn't have to climb stairs. Every time I tucked her in, I caught myself watching her breathe, counting the rise and fall of her chest like a silent prayer. One night after I thought she'd fallen asleep, I heard her small voice in the dark. "Mommy, are they in jail?" she asked. The question made my chest tighten. "Yes, baby," I said softly. "They can't hurt you anymore." She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "Why did they hate me?" I sat down beside her and brushed her hair back. "They didn't understand love," I said, my voice trembling. "But you do. That's what matters." I started keeping a journal, writing down everything, every conversation with the police, every medical update, every time Grace woke from a nightmare calling for me. I didn't know why I wrote it all down, only that it made the chaos feel a little less impossible. A week later, Officer Ruiz called. "The DA's ready to proceed," she said. "They're moving forward with attempted murder." She explained that the trial could take months, maybe longer, and that the state would need me to testify. "I'll be there," I said, though the thought of facing them again made my stomach turn. In the days leading up to the first hearing, the media swarmed the courthouse. Headlines spread across local stations, "Respected couple accused of attacking grandchild." The words didn't sound real, not when paired with their polished photographs, their charity work, their country club memberships. It was the same mask they'd worn all my life, only now the cracks showed beneath the gloss. Grace continued her slow recovery, while I balanced work-leave hospital visits and meetings with the prosecutor. Julia Carter, the ADA assigned to the case, was sharp and steady, her tone firm but kind. "The evidence is strong," she said during our first meeting. "We'll need your testimony to show motive and pattern." Their words that night matter. She slid a transcript across the table, the 911 call I'd made replaying in neat lines of text. Seeing the words in print made my stomach twist. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, I stood outside the courthouse steps with Julia and Officer Ruiz. Cameras flashed from behind barricades, their shouts muffled by the wind. Ethan held my hand briefly before leading me inside. My parents sat at the defense table, dressed in dark suits, their faces composed. They looked exactly as they always had, elegant, controlled, unflinching. For a moment, it was like I was 12 again, waiting to be scolded for something I didn't do. Then I remembered Grace's bruised face, and the fear faded into something colder and steadier. The hearing was brief, mostly procedural, but it was enough to make my hands shake. I kept my eyes on the judge as the charges were read aloud. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, child abuse. Each word was another piece of the truth laid bare. My parents didn't flinch. When it was over, they were escorted out in cuffs, and I caught the faintest trace of a smirk on my father's face as he passed. That night I couldn't sleep. Grace stirred in her bed, whimpering in her dreams. I sat beside her, whispering the same promise I'd made in the hospital. "You're safe. You're not alone." The moonlight pooled across the floor, quiet and cold. For the first time, I realized that the trial wasn't just about punishment. It was about finally ending the story that had started long before that night, back when love in our family was something you had to earn. The next morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared out the window. The sun was rising, turning the sky the same pale gold that used to fill the guest room at my parents' house. Grace wandered in, rubbing her eyes, and climbed into my lap. "Are we okay now?" she asked. I wrapped my arms around her. "We're getting there," I said. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street and life kept moving. Inside, the quiet felt different, not empty anymore, just waiting. The fight for justice wasn't over, but for the first time I could see the path ahead, and I knew that when the time came to speak in court, I wouldn't tremble, because this time I wasn't the one being silenced. I was the one holding the truth. The weeks after the preliminary hearing passed in a blur of appointments and sleepless nights. Every time the phone rang, I braced myself for another update or request from the prosecutor's office. Grace was recovering at home, moving slowly but determined. She still flinched when anyone raised a hand too quickly, even to reach for a cup. Her left eye was healing, though the bruising around it had turned faint yellow. I read to her every night the same book she'd loved before. Everything happened, soft animal stories with gentle endings. Sometimes halfway through, she'd drift off against my arm, and I'd just sit there listening to her steady breathing, afraid to let go. Officer Ruiz stopped by one morning to drop off paperwork and check in. She stood by the doorway, hat in her hands. "The DA's office is moving quickly," she said. "They want to schedule your deposition for next week. Julia Carter will walk you through what to expect." I thanked her, my voice tight. Ruiz hesitated, glancing toward the living room where Grace was coloring. "She's tougher than she looks," she said quietly, then gave a small nod before leaving. A few days later, I met with Julia Carter at the county courthouse. Her office was small, stacked with case files and coffee cups. She offered me water before sitting across the desk. "I know this isn't easy," she said, "but you've been strong since day one. What you remember from that night, the words they said, your reaction, that's what will help the jury understand motive." She opened a binder and turned it toward me. Inside were photographs I'd already seen too many times: Grace's swollen face, the hospital room, the shattered illusion of family. I looked away. "We'll make sure she doesn't have to relive this," Julia added. "She won't testify. You will speak for her." When I got home, Grace was with Ethan drawing flowers on pink construction paper. He looked up when I walked in. "How did it go?" he asked. I managed a smile. "It's moving forward." He nodded, understanding too well what that meant. After he left for the night, I tucked Grace in and sat at the kitchen table with the folder Ruiz had given me, the words, "State of Connecticut v." Martin and Evelyn Parker stared back from the cover. It was strange seeing their names in print like that, stripped of the titles I'd grown up using. Dr. Andrea Lutz, the therapist Julia recommended, began visiting twice a week. Her sessions were gentle, quiet. Grace liked her almost immediately. They built stories with puppets and practiced deep breathing whenever the memories crept in. When Dr. Lutz spoke to me afterward, her tone was calm but direct. "Trauma can echo through generations," she said once. "You've broken that cycle. But now you need to heal the part of you that still sees them as parents." The truth of it sat heavy between us. I nodded but didn't answer. One evening, while sorting through the mail, I found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph: Grace at her last birthday, smiling, wide frosting on her chin. On the back, written in neat cursive, were the words, "You'll regret this." My hand shook as I showed it to Ethan. "We'll take it to Ruiz," he said immediately. She confirmed the next day that it had likely come from one of their supporters. "They've still got people defending them," she said, her jaw tight. "We'll make sure it's documented." The first real shift came when Grace asked to go outside again. It was late March, the air still cool but bright with promise. We walked to the small park near our apartment, her hand gripping mine as if the world might fall apart if she let go. She watched other children play on the swings, then turned to me. "Can I try?" she asked. I nodded. She climbed slowly, uncertain at first, but when she felt the wind brush her face, she smiled, tentative, then real. That moment, brief as it was, felt like sunlight after a long storm. At night, I sometimes dreamed of my childhood home. In those dreams, the walls gleamed and the smell of lemon polish filled the air, but the rooms were empty. No laughter, no warmth, just the echo of my father's voice correcting my mother's silence, pressing down. I'd wake before dawn, sitting up in the quiet apartment, trying to breathe through the memory. Dr. Lutz said that kind of dream wasn't unusual. "You're seeing the truth without the disguise," she told me. That's progress. By the time the trial date was announced, I'd stopped counting the days since the attack. Each one felt like its own small battle therapy follow-up statements, all leading to the moment I would have to face them again. Julia met with me twice a week, preparing me for testimony. "They'll try to make you doubt yourself," she warned. "They'll twist your words, question your memory, your choices. Stay calm. The truth is on record." Ethan took extra shifts off work so he could watch Grace while I attended the pretrial meetings. We'd fallen into an easy rhythm, not as husband and wife, but as two people bound by something stronger than the past. One night, as we sat on the couch watching Grace sleep, he said quietly, "You know, she looks at you like you hung the moon." I didn't answer, but I felt the warmth of it settle in my chest. A week before the trial, Julia called. "We're going to request psychological evaluations on both defendants," she said. "Their attorneys claiming diminished capacity, stress, confusion, you name it. It's a tactic, but it won't change the evidence." I thanked her, though my hands were shaking. Hearing my parents described as defendants still felt unreal. Grace's nightmares grew less frequent as the date drew closer, though she still clung to her stuffed bunny at night. The morning before jury selection, she drew a picture of the three of us, her, me, and Ethan, standing under a sky filled with stars. "It's for you," she said. I pinned it to the refrigerator before leaving for the courthouse. That day, the building smelled of coffee and floor polish. Reporters lingered outside, their cameras ready. Inside, Julia walked beside me, her tone even but firm. "Remember," she said, "they don't get to control the story anymore. You do." I nodded, steadying my breath. When the courtroom doors opened, I caught sight of them sitting at the defense table. My mother wore her pearls, my father, his favorite navy suit. They looked calm, almost indifferent, as though this were just another charity luncheon. My heart pounded, but the fear that had ruled me since childhood was gone. All that remained was resolve. The proceedings began with formalities, motions, and paperwork. Alan Pierce, their attorney, was polished and practiced his voice smooth as he requested leniency and respect for two pillars of the community. I barely heard him. My eyes stayed on Grace's drawing folded in my pocket, the colors pressed faintly into my palm. When court recessed for the day, Julia placed a hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow you testify," she said. The hallway buzzed with reporters, camera flashes reflecting off the marble walls. I kept walking, one step after another, the sound of their voices fading behind me. That night, after Grace fell asleep, I sat by her bed and watched the moonlight trace the faint scars on her cheek. They were healing, but they would always be there, quiet reminders of what we'd survived. I brushed her hair back and whispered, "It's almost over, baby. We're going to finish this." The next morning would bring my day on the stand, and for the first time since it all began, I wasn't afraid of my parents seeing me. I was ready for them to hear the truth from my own voice, and this time they wouldn't be able to silence it. The morning of my testimony came cold and still, the kind of morning that made every sound sharper. The courthouse steps gleamed from last night's rain. I walked through the metal detectors with Julia at my side, her voice calm as she reminded me to breathe. "Answer only what's asked," she said. "You've already lived the hardest part. Now you just have to tell it." I nodded, clutching the folded drawing Grace had made a tiny reminder of why I was there. Inside, the courtroom looked smaller than it had in my nightmares. My parents sat at the defense table, both dressed as if for Sunday service. My mother wore pale blue, her pearls shining under the overhead lights. My father's cufflinks caught the same reflection. They looked at me when I entered, but neither smiled. The jurors shifted in their seats as the clerk called my name. I walked to the stand, raised my hand, and swore to tell the truth. Julia's questions began softly like stepping stones across a dark river. She guided me back through the day of the party, the invitation, the car ride, the sound of laughter echoing through the hall. Then she asked about the kitchen. "Can you tell the court what you heard your father say that afternoon?" I felt the breath leave my chest, but I forced the words out. He raised his glass and said, "Finally, she'll match her worth." "And your mother?" Julia asked. "She said she wanted everyone to know only her real grandchild mattered." I looked toward the jury, though my eyes blurred. She meant my brother's daughter, Harper. A few jurors lowered their eyes. Julia nodded gently, letting the silence hang before moving on. "What did you do next?" "I went upstairs," I said. "I found my daughter bleeding unconscious." Her face was unrecognizable. The words trembled out, and Julia gave me a moment to steady myself. "And what did your parents do when you came down?" "They said she must have fallen," I whispered. They laughed. The courtroom felt frozen in that instant. Julia thanked me and turned back toward her table. No further questions. Alan Pierce rose for cross-examination, smooth and unhurried. His tone was almost kind, but every word carried an edge. "Ms. Bennett," he began, "you've had financial trouble since your divorce, haven't you?" "Yes." "And your parents didn't help?" "They refused to control me," I said before I could stop myself. He smiled faintly. "Control or protect you from yourself. You left law school, married a mechanic, and when that fell apart, you blamed your parents, didn't you?" I met his gaze. "I blamed them for hurting my child." The room went silent again. Alan's expression didn't change. "You claim to have heard your father make a cruel remark about your daughter's worth. "Isn't it possible you misunderstood that he was referring to something else?" "No," I said, steady now. "He meant exactly what he said." Julia objected to the tone of the question, and Judge O'Neill sustained it, but the damage was done. Alan's intention was clear: to make me sound emotional, unreliable. Still, when I looked toward the jury, I saw no mockery in their faces, only shock. Julia called Dr. Kim next. She testified that Grace's injuries came from multiple blunt impacts, not a fall, not an accident. The photos appeared on the projector behind her, images I could never unsee. Several jurors covered their mouths. Andrew took the stand afterward, hands shaking. I heard my mother say it, he told the court. She said, "Only my real grandchild matters." She laughed. Brooke confirmed it, her voice quiet but certain. For the first time, my mother's composure faltered. She leaned toward my father, whispering something that made his jaw tighten. When the defense began calling their witnesses, the tone of the room changed. Neighbors, church members, and former colleagues all spoke about what a loving couple my parents were. Words like devoted, generous, and pillars of the community filled the air. I sat there listening, feeling each one land like a false stone in a wall meant to hide the truth. Not one of them mentioned Grace. Most didn't even know she existed. Finally, my father took the stand. His voice was calm, practiced. "We were horrified by what happened to our granddaughter," he said. "But Nora has always been dramatic. She imagines slights that aren't there." His eyes flicked toward me, full of pity he didn't feel. "My wife was in shock that day. I never said anything cruel." Julia stepped forward. "Mr. Parker, when police arrived, you told them, quote, 'There's no proof we did anything, hearsay from a hysterical mother.' Why would you say that if you were innocent?" He shifted in his chair. "Because she's accused us of things before, of violence, of being unfair." Julia's tone stayed steady. "Unfair or abusive?" He hesitated. "We were strict, that's all." She took a step closer. "Did you say to your daughter just before she found her child beaten, 'Finally she'll match her worth'?" Alan Pierce objected, but the judge allowed it. My father looked at me, then something cruel flickering behind his eyes. "I said it," he replied, but it was sarcasm. "You people twist everything." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Julia's voice was quiet when she spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that wasn't sarcasm. That was confession." My father's smirk faded as the room filled with whispers. For the first time in years, he looked unsure. Julia returned to her seat, leaving his words hanging like a crack of thunder that wouldn't stop echoing. When I stepped down from the witness stand, my knees shook, but my heart was steady. I passed close to my mother's chair on the way back to my seat. She leaned toward me, her perfume familiar and sharp, and whispered, "You'll regret this." I stopped just long enough to meet her eyes. "No, Mom," I said quietly. "You will." Outside reporters shouted questions as the bailiff cleared the hall. Julia shielded me with a firm arm, guiding me to a waiting room down the corridor. I sank into a chair, my pulse still racing. "You did exactly what you needed to," she said. "That admission from your father just changed everything." When I got home that night, Grace was asleep on the couch, her stuffed bunny under her arm. Ethan looked up from the kitchen table. "How did it go?" he asked. I sat down beside him, too tired to answer at first. "He admitted it," I said finally. "In front of everyone." Ethan exhaled his hand, finding mine. Then, the truth's finally out. The next morning, the headlines spread fast. "Respected couple's trial, shaken by daughter's testimony." The phone buzzed nonstop with reporters asking for statements, but I didn't respond. I made pancakes for Grace instead, watching her smile at the smell, the bruises fading from her face. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt the balance begin to shift. They had built their lives on control, on silence. Now the silence belonged to me, and I would decide when it broke. The verdict was still days away, but as I tucked Grace into bed that evening, I knew something in me had already changed. Whatever came next, I had faced them and spoken the truth they spent a lifetime burying. And when the time came for judgment, I wouldn't flinch. The courthouse was quieter the morning the verdict came down. The air felt heavier somehow, like everyone already knew what was about to happen. I sat in the front row beside Julia, my palms cold against my knees. Across the aisle, my parents were led in by deputies, both still dressed in the same tailored suits they'd worn all trial. My mother's hair was pinned perfectly, her lipstick precise, as if control could still save her. My father kept his chin high, but the color in his face had faded to gray. The judge entered, and everyone rose. I stood too, though my legs trembled. The bailiff's voice carried across the room, "All rise for the Honorable Judge O'Neill." Chairs scraped the floor as we sat again. The jurors filed in, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The foreman clutched a folded sheet of paper, his hands shaking just slightly. The judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman said. The words that followed felt like thunder rolling through the room. "On the count of attempted murder, we find the defendants, Martin and Evelyn Parker, guilty. On the count of aggravated assault, guilty. On the count of child abuse, guilty." There was a collective gasp, some sharp intake of breath that seemed to pull the air from my lungs. My mother let out a strangled cry, rising halfway from her seat before the deputies caught her arms. My father didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the far wall, unblinking. Julia reached for my hand under the table, her grip steady. "It's done," she whispered. Judge O'Neill's voice was firm when she spoke. "This court finds your actions not only criminal, but morally reprehensible. You betrayed the most sacred trust, the safety of a child." Her words cut through the whispers and camera clicks. "Your cruelty was deliberate, calculated, and beyond comprehension. You will serve your sentences accordingly." When the bailiff read the years aloud, 25 for my father, 20 for my mother, the room erupted again. Reporters' scribbled flashes flickered, and the murmur of voices swelled into chaos. I stayed still, unable to move or speak. For so long I'd imagined this moment, what justice might sound like, how it might feel. But sitting there, all I could think about was Grace's small hand in mine, and how none of it could undo what had already been done. The deputies led my parents away in chains. My mother sobbed openly, insisting she hadn't meant it, her voice high and frantic. My father turned once toward me, his expression hollow. "This family was weak before you ruined it," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Then they were gone. Julia stood smoothing the front of her jacket. "You did what you came to do," she said quietly. "Go home to your daughter." I nodded, the sound of chains still echoing faintly in my ears. Outside the courthouse, the gray sky hung low. Reporters waited at the bottom of the steps, microphones raised. "Ms. Bennett, do you have a statement?" "Do you forgive them?" someone shouted. I kept walking. Forgiveness wasn't even close to what I felt. Ethan was waiting by the curb, his coat collar turned up against the wind. When I reached him, he touched my shoulder gently. "You did it," he said. "They'll never hurt her again." His voice cracked just slightly. I nodded, but my chest ached with everything that still felt unfinished. Back home, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of Grace's nightlight. She was asleep, her hair spread across the pillow, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. I sat beside her bed and brushed my fingers through her hair. The bruises had faded now to pale gold. "It's over," I whispered, though part of me wasn't sure it ever really would be. That night, I dreamed of the sound that had started it all, the clink of champagne glasses in a perfect kitchen. In the dream, the sound broke like glass hitting tile, and then there was only silence. When I woke, dawn was creeping through the curtains. Grace stirred beside me, mumbling softly, "Mommy, I'm here." I kissed her forehead. "Always," I said. The days that followed passed in fragments, paperwork, follow-up meetings, endless calls from reporters that I ignored. The prosecutor's office handled the final logistics, and soon after a restitution order arrived. My parents' assets were seized, the estate, the cars, the investment accounts. Every cent went toward Grace's medical bills, therapy, and her education fund. I didn't want their money, but I accepted it for her sake. For weeks, I moved through the motions of ordinary life. I made breakfast, folded laundry, read bedtime stories. Grace began sleeping through the night again, though. Sometimes she still woke from a nightmare and climbed into my bed. On those nights, I'd wrap my arms around her and listen to the sound of her breathing until morning. Ethan came by often. We weren't rebuilding a marriage, not exactly, but something quieter, trust maybe, or friendship. One evening after Grace had fallen asleep, he said, "You know she looks at you like you're the safest place in the world." I smiled faintly. I just wish I'd protected her sooner. You did, he said. Not in time to stop the pain, but you never stopped fighting for her. His words settled in the air between us, soft and steady. Andrew called a week after the sentencing. I've cut all contact, he said. Brooke and I are moving. We want Harper to grow up without this shadow. He paused, his voice cracking. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner, Nora. Seeing it now is enough, I told him. By the time spring came, small pieces of normal life had begun returning. Grace went back to school part-time, her teachers kind and patient. Dr. Lutz continued therapy with both of us, helping Grace name her fears and helping me learn to breathe again. She once said, healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means building a life that exists beyond the pain. One evening as Grace colored at the kitchen table, she asked, Are Grandma and Grandpa still mad? The question stopped me cold. I thought for a moment before answering. Maybe I said carefully, but that's not something we have to carry anymore. She nodded her crayon, pausing mid-stroke. Good, she said softly. I like it better when we're happy. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I stood by her door for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. The house was still the kind of stillness I hadn't known in years. For the first time, peace didn't feel like something fragile. It felt earned. Yet as quiet as that peace was, I knew healing would take longer. There would still be moments when the past reached out a scent, a sound, a sudden flash of memory, but it wouldn't have power anymore. The truth had been spoken, the lies broken apart in daylight, and for the first time, we were free. Outside, the night was clear stars, sharp against the dark sky. I stepped onto the porch and let the cool air fill my lungs. Somewhere far away, a train whistle sounded a low, steady note that carried through the stillness. Behind me, the soft glow from Grace's window spilled across the grass. It wasn't the ending I once imagined, but it was a beginning. Tomorrow would come, and the world would keep moving forward. And this time, we'd move with it not as victims, but as survivors, learning how to live in the light again. 2 months passed before the noise around the trial began to fade. Reporters stopped calling, and the courthouse that had once been filled with cameras felt like a memory I wanted to leave behind. The world had moved on, but inside our small apartment, healing had its own quiet rhythm. Mornings began with pancakes instead of panic, and Grace's laughter slowly returned lighter now, but still cautious, as if happiness needed to be tested before it could stay. Therapy with Dr. Lutz became part of our weekly routine. Grace would sit on the rug, arranging her dolls into tiny families, while Dr. Lutz guided her through stories of bravery and safety. When she asked how I was sleeping, I told her the truth that most nights I still woke to the faint echo of sirens or the imagined sound of glass breaking. She said healing takes time and that survival sometimes means learning how to breathe in smaller pieces until the air comes easy again. One afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office to sign the final restitution documents. The estate sale had gone through. My parents' house, the same one that once smelled of lemon polish and rules, was gone. The funds had been transferred into a trust for Grace's care and education. I sat in the car afterward, staring at the courthouse across the street. The place that had once felt like a battlefield was now just another building. Andrew called that evening. Brooke and I listed our house, he said. We're heading north, somewhere quieter. His voice softened. Madison keeps asking if she can write to Grace. I smiled at the thought. Of course, I said. She'd like that. He hesitated before adding, You did what none of us could. You broke it. There was a long pause before he said goodbye, and I understood what he meant. Grace began first grade that fall. Her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, called me in one afternoon. She's doing wonderfully, she said, handing me a small paper with Grace's handwriting. At the top, she'd written, My hero. Below it were the words, uneven but certain. My mom is my hero because she never gave up. She made sure bad people can't hurt me. She tells me I'm brave even when I feel small. The paper trembled in my hands. For all the courtrooms and verdicts, this single page felt like the real justice we'd been waiting for. That evening, Grace waited on the porch painting a sunset with her small box of watercolors. "Look, Mommy," she said, holding it up proudly. 2 stick figures stood under a sky of orange and blue. "It's us." I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and said, "It's beautiful." She tilted her head. "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa are still mad?" I paused, searching for the right words. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said gently. "But that's not something we need to carry anymore." She nodded thoughtfully. "Good," she said, "because I like it better when we're happy." We moved a few months later. A small house near the lake, quiet and full of light. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The first night, Grace helped me unpack the kitchen, stacking mismatched plates and handing me utensils one at a time. "This feels like a new start," she said, her voice proud and sure. I smiled, realizing she'd said what I hadn't yet dared to believe. Ethan visited often. He helped us paint the porch railing, his hands streaked with white by the end of the day. Watching him teach Grace how to sand the edges, I saw the way she leaned into his words, trusting again. When we sat on the steps afterward, he said quietly, "You've built something solid, Nora, for both of you." The sun dipped low, scattering gold across the water, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight in my chest begin to ease. Winter came early that year. Snow fell in thick, steady flakes that blanketed everything in silence. On the anniversary of the verdict, I lit a candle by the window. Grace asked why. "For peace," I said simply. She nodded, climbed into my lap, and whispered, "We have that now." I held her close, listening to the soft tick of the clock and the quiet hum of the furnace. Dr. Lutz later suggested I join a support group for survivors of family violence. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to revisit those memories, but sitting in that small circle of strangers, I found something unexpected, understanding. We talked about fear, shame, forgiveness, and how none of it followed a straight line. One woman said, "Sometimes justice feels loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of your child laughing again." The room went still, and I felt tears warm my cheeks. Months passed, and the shape of our days grew steadier. Grace started music lessons, her small hands learning piano keys like they were old friends. She played simple songs, hesitant at first, then more certain. I would listen from the kitchen, her melody filling the space where silence used to live. One evening after tucking her in, I found an old photo tucked in a book, me as a little girl standing between my parents, our smiles perfectly rehearsed. I turned it over, tracing the date with my thumb, and realized I felt nothing, not anger, not grief, just distance, like the memory belonged to someone else. I placed it back in the drawer and closed it softly. In March, we planted a small garden behind the house. Grace chose the seeds, lavender daisies and sunflowers. "Flowers that reach for the sun," she said with a grin. As we worked, she asked, "Do you think Grandma ever said sorry?" I looked at her, the dirt on her hands, the hope in her eyes. "Maybe," I said, "but we don't need her to. We already forgave ourselves for what they did." She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and pressed another seed into the soil. That night, as the rain began to fall, I stood by the window watching droplets trace down the glass. For so long I had measured peace by the absence of pain. Now I understood it differently. It was the quiet strength that remained after the storm. When I checked on Grace before bed, she was asleep, one arm around her bunny, the other resting on the edge of the quilt. Her scars had faded to faint silver lines, catching the soft glow from the nightlight. I brushed a kiss across her forehead and whispered, "You're my hero too, sweetheart." Outside, the lake shimmered beneath the moonlight. The wind rustled through the trees, and the world felt still again. We had spent years trapped in their shadows, fighting for justice that nearly broke us. But standing there in the soft light of our new home, I realized we had already won. Justice wasn't only what the court had given us, it was what we'd rebuilt together. The next morning, Grace ran barefoot into the yard, shouting for me to come see. One of the sunflower sprouts had broken through the soil, small and green, but strong. I knelt beside her, smiling. "See?" she said, eyes bright. "It found the sun." I nodded, feeling the warmth spread through me. "Yes, it did," I said softly. "So did we." The garden shimmered in the morning light, the air cool and full of promise. I stood there watching her, realizing this was how healing looked, not perfect, but alive. And though I knew the past would never disappear, I also knew it no longer owned us. We were growing, reaching for the light one day at a time, just like those tiny flowers. Spring drifted into summer, and our little lake house began to feel like it had always been home. The garden Grace and I planted was full of life now, lavender swaying in the breeze, sunflowers reaching high toward the sky. Every morning she ran outside barefoot, whispering to the blooms like they were old friends. I'd watch from the porch with my coffee, amazed at how far we'd come from that terrible night. Life didn't turn perfect. There were still quiet moments when the past tried to whisper back certain smells, sudden shadows, but they didn't hold power anymore. Dr. Lutz said, "Healing often looks ordinary breakfasts made on time laughter in the hallway, a child sleeping without fear." And she was right. The ordinary had become sacred to us. Ethan still came by on weekends. Sometimes we'd take Grace fishing or drive into town for ice cream. We didn't talk much about the years that had broken us apart. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed. It wasn't full of pain anymore. It was calm, almost grateful. Once when Grace ran ahead on the trail, he turned to me and said, "You gave her a chance to grow up free, Nora." I didn't answer, but the words settled deep. Andrew called one afternoon to tell me they'd settled into their new town. Harper was taking piano lessons like Grace, and the two of them had started writing letters back and forth, handwritten notes filled with stickers and stories about school. "You know," he said softly, "maybe someday our kids will remember each other for the good things, not the history." It was the first time I heard real hope in his voice. One evening, Grace brought me a book she'd found at the library, a children's story about forgiveness. She asked if people like Grandma and Grandpa could ever say sorry. I told her maybe they could, but some people never do. She thought for a moment, then said, "That's okay. We don't have to wait for sorry to be happy." I smiled because she'd spoken a truth I'd spent years learning. As the weeks passed, the nightmares faded. Grace slept peacefully now, her scars soft against the glow of the nightlight. Sometimes she'd roll over in her sleep and mumble something about sunshine or flowers. I'd sit beside her bed and feel the quiet hum of peace fill the room, the kind that doesn't erase pain, but grows around it steady and sure. By the second summer, our lives had found a rhythm that felt strong and real. Grace started piano recitals at the community center. Ethan and I sat together in the front row, proud beyond words. When she bowed at the end, I caught her looking for me first, that same shy smile she'd had since she was small. One Sunday, I drove alone to the edge of town and parked outside the courthouse. The building was closed quiet under the afternoon sun. I sat there for a while, not out of anger or grief, but to remember. Justice had happened there loud and public, but peace had been found here in the life we rebuilt. Before heading home, I stopped by the cemetery. A few plots over from the old family section, a simple marker read, "Martin and Evelyn Parker." No flowers, no visitors. I stood there for a long time, the breeze cool against my face. I didn't bring anger with me that day. I brought gratitude for the lesson, for the strength it forced me to find, and for the chance to start again without them. I whispered, "We're okay now," and left without looking back. That evening, Grace and I walked along the lakeshore as the sky turned gold. She skipped ahead, splashing her toes in the water, and called over her shoulder, "Mommy, look! The sun's setting, but it's still bright." I smiled, realizing how right she was. Even endings can hold their own kind of light. Back home, I tucked her into bed and sat beside her until her breathing slowed. I thought about everything we'd survived, the lies, the silence, the years of pretending, and how it had all led to this one simple truth. Worth isn't something anyone gives you. It's something you build for yourself piece by piece, no matter what they tried to take away. Outside, the night was still. The moonlight spilled across the garden, catching on the tips of the sunflowers that had grown taller than both of us. I stood at the window for a long time, listening to the soft rhythm of the water against the shore. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for peace to arrive. It was already here, quiet, patient, and ours. If you've ever had to walk through something dark to find your own light again, you know what that means? Maybe share this story with someone who needs a little reminder that healing is possible and that justice, when it finally comes, can look a lot like peace.